Hello, thank you for joining us. I'm Katie English. I'm a professional services engineer with Jamf Software, and we're here to talk about the whole elephant. And I'm going to explain exactly what we mean by that pretty soon. But basically, we're talking about IT service management and stepwise integration with the Casper Suite. And I've also got my good friend Stephen Hurtado from Pomona College in Claremont, California. And he's going to talk about his real-world experience actually integrating Casper with an existing service catalog. So we'll get to that in just a minute. That's us, by the way. Okay, so we're going to start off talking a little bit about ITSM, service management in general, just sort of a 30,000-foot view to say, what are we talking about here, and why do we care? Then we'll get more specific into Stephen's own experience at Pomona College, including the process of continual service improvement. This is actually built into the concept of ITSM, the fact that we're never really actually done. We're always trying to get better. His takeaways from his process, and also we're kind of going to expand a little bit. And this is going to be a little bit of improv and a little bit of kind of guessing about the future, because unfortunately Apple wasn't very nice and didn't release Mavericks in time for us to actually talk about it actively at this conference. So this isn't going to be a whole lot of very definitive stuff that we can talk about today. But that's the whole point of service management, is to be able to expand this later and improvise for the future. Okay, so what do we mean about the whole elephant? This is actually in reference to a boss Stephen and I have both had in the past, who's very fond of referring to big tasks as elephants. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So unfortunately for our little clip art friend, that's what we're gonna do as our approach. This is a big task. When you start breaking apart service management, it's alarming, it's intimidating. There's a lot of moving parts, and it's easy enough to just go, nah, I'm not gonna bother. So we're actually gonna back off a bit and take off little bite-sized pieces at a time and figure out how to, for example, integrate Casper just one little bit at a time with an existing service catalog. IT service management is really, it's meta IT. It's talking about information technology. It's information technology talking about being better at giving services to customers. And it's not a technical conversation. This is very much organizational. This is, how do I offer services to customers? How do I offer services internally to my own IT staff? And we are very focused on our processes. It's describing the act of giving IT support. And we're very focused on best practices. And this is, again, back to our continual service improvement, always trying to improve. The challenges, there's actually a bunch of them. Defining the actual services, I offer Mac management. What the heck is that? How do I define that for the purposes of my audience, my constituents, the people that I actually want to give Mac management to? This is a big one for admins. It's a mindset change. Proactive versus reactive. It's very instinctive for us as admins to want to run to a fire and put it out. It's a lot sexier than trying to put together an SLA that we can meet with 98% efficiency. It's easier to just run into the office, swoop in, and save somebody's email rather than make sure that we've constructed a self-service portal for somebody to restore their own data. This is also hard because people like to squirrel away their own information, but back to what we were talking about in the keynote yesterday, we want to share information. We want to share knowledge. We want to spread this out across the enterprise. We don't want to just be the Mac admins and we're the only people who can do this. We want to kind of offload this to the rest of the enterprise and make sure that everybody's involved in our service. The evolving delivery of service, Stephen's going to talk about this too, in terms of how we migrate from one management functionality to another. What takeaways do we get from one management service? How do we evolve? How do we do better in the future? And this was the big one for me, the changing admin mindset. I've worked with admins who they don't really want to invest the time and energy in maybe documenting the services that they provide, maybe for a purpose of liability. If I write it down, somebody's going to ask me to do it later. Maybe also just a matter of kind of hoarding that information for themselves. I did this, I'm going to keep it for later, it's going to be mine. But there's also, again, that reactive versus proactive mindset. Can we kind of break that habit of being the superhero who charges in to fix things and actually just sort of be the one quietly in the shadow building services that just work and are continually getting better without having to rush in and put out fires? So here's the part where I hand off to a real customer doing real life things. My friend Stephen Hurtado is the Computer Resources Manager at Pomona College in Claremont, California, where he manages about 1,000 Macs. About, okay. And he's going to talk about integrating the Casper Suite into their existing service catalog. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you, Katie. Hello, everyone. So as mentioned, my name is Stephen Hurtado, and I'll tell you a little bit more about my organization in a second, but a few kind of, just to lay a little bit of the groundwork. One of the keys when we're talking about service management is just remembering that at its core, the idea is we want to provide value to our customers in the form of services. It's kind of not really any more complicated than that. What we do at our core is this level of customer service where we're saying you have your goals within our organization. How can we add to what you're doing so that you can do it better, so that you can do it more efficiently? A number of different things, but the key is that it should be valuable. And unfortunately, value is a little bit of a subjective term because what we may find valuable may not always match up with what the customer wants. But value really needs to be customer driven. For better or worse, that's how it goes. We have people with their own expectations, and as much as we have a lot of understanding and technical knowledge of things, it's what the customer finds useful, what they're trying to work with, the tools that they're interested in using. That's what's valuable to them. So as great as something can be, if they don't see it as valuable, it really doesn't hold a lot of value in their minds. Fortunately for us, it's also staff supported. So value comes into play, and this is where we come in as admins, is that whether it's just you might be the only person in your organization responsible for supporting or providing some service. It might be a team, it might be a global team. But we also have a lot of impact in that because we have a specific knowledge and skill set. We've taken the time to invest and understand in a lot of these technologies so that we can actually present them in such a way that they are valuable, that the customer may understand, when they're offering this to me, it's not just one more thing IT wants to do to my computer, but that it is actually going to offer some value. In addition, value is often driven by the organization as a whole. It may have a mission or a commitment to certain things. In the educational case, that's one of our things. We have the educational mission of the college that we're supposed to be concerned with at all times, and that plays an impact onto what is valuable. So with that, and as we look at tools and services, it's important to remember that things like Casper are tools. It'd be great in some ways if Casper was this wonderful whole service thing that we were offering, but it's not really useful if I go up to a faculty member and say, hey, I just got the Casper Suite for you. They're going to look at me and kind of say, so what? What does that have to do with anything? But services in the realms of the different ways that we would, for example, support Macs, that's what's useful to them. So to have this kind of distinguishing thing in our mind of what are the tools that we have to help us provide, improve on, and offer better services. So with that, a little bit of the history of our school, as we've just undergone a new college mark, kind of heralding back to the old days a little bit and looking a little more something. I'm not too sure there. But the idea of Pomona, it's a small liberal arts college, about 1,500 to 1,600 students, a few hundred faculty members, and a few hundred more staff there. So it's very small. It's part of a consortium, which means that we have 8 different institutions there that are all very independently run, but choose to do some things together. Among that means 8 different IT departments. So at times we share things, and other times schools will take the lead and kind of figure out what works out best for them. But in the context of that, I could start off, so Pomona was founded in 1887 and work its way through. That history isn't that useful. I'm going to talk about when I arrived as a student, first off in 2004. I came in there, and it was mostly a Windows environment. There were Macs around. They hadn't been just completely neglected. There was at least a little bit of thought put to them. But it was a mostly Windows environment. That was still a time when, as students, we were bringing desktops more often than laptops to campus and all that. And over the next few years, one of the biggest things we saw was that with the switch to Intel, suddenly Macs became a lot more usable within our environment, because you had faculty members that wanted to teach in a classroom, and one faculty member would only want to work in Windows, one would only want to work in the Mac OS, and you either had to deal with crazy registrar scheduling, or you were just stuck using whichever one was offered. But with the ability to have both operating systems, that really, for us, increased the number of Macs that we saw. And in the same way for our labs, you could now have a professor who maybe had a tool on one platform that they couldn't use because it would have meant sacrificing other tools that were only available on the other. So with some of those changes in mind, we saw an increase in the number of computers. And this is where it gets into a little bit of my role. So computer resources manager, if you were to try to tell me what that meant, I bet you could come up with all different sorts of things. It's a pretty vague title. It started out as a position that was relatively just a lab manager role. And if I were to give you the 5-second summary, I manage lab computers, classroom computers, and all software for the campus, which puts kind of an interesting position together, because it means it's not just lab focused. I'm very concerned with how faculty and staff are using the labs and using the classroom machines. But that whole all software component really adds a level of support that changes things, because now the service we're providing is not just to a very controlled piece of equipment that I've managed to set up and deploy, but well, we have to be able to deploy software to faculty machines where they may have full control and but still want us to kind of work around their needs and understanding. So with that, we're at a point where there's, as Katie mentioned, there's about 1,000 Macs that are being managed on campus. I'm directly responsible for about 500 computers within that, and about 300 of those are Macs in the lab and classroom state. What this means for us is that really took Macs to a place where they can't just be ignored. We have to start thinking, as we're developing these services, as it came to be, that Macs needed to be thought about and have services developed with them in mind, and not just as an afterthought. So where I'll go with that is that we want to make sure that we're taking the time to really plan with them in mind, and to start thinking of services in such a way that that you're really recognizing what are the needs of your organization. In education, it may be very different from certain business aspects. I know we give a lot more free rein to our users than some places are either by law allowed to, or maybe just have found it workable. But with that, and with being the idea being very kind of consumer or customer focused, that's really where we go into this. So looking just a few more minutes here on kind of the general ITS service management piece in general, and how that's now played in. So with all of the computing changes that we've seen, it was important to take service management account as a whole. And that started off for us, and this gets into the bite-by-bite eating of the elephant, per se. We began with just incident management. So, okay, calls and things come in. How do we just track them, work them through to some type of resolution? And that's a good place to start. Hopefully, many of you are doing that in some fashion. But then you really want to expand it, because if someone in your organization makes maybe a change, it's much better to have a system in place where you can actually track that change, see who it's going to impact, try to notify people ahead of time, and be prepared for potential problems with that. It's much easier to address customer concerns when you're aware that there might be an impact versus when you just find out that something changed and it broke things. So if I were to tell, I mean, looking at this over the last 10 years or so, going from relatively just having incident management to having a place where you have problem management, change management, configuration management and inventory, various things on ITIL training. I was unfortunate that I started working as a full-time staff member right after they did all the training on ITIL and some of this ITSM pieces. So it's been a little bit more piecemeal for me figuring it out. But looking at all these pieces together, if you were to say kind of, we have to get all this stuff implemented, it is overwhelming. And it really kind of pertains in the same way to the Casper Suite. I don't know how many of you were maybe just a quick show of hands, how many were just impressed by the things Casper can offer? I mean, it seems like there's a ton of stuff there. When I sat down and I was developing my can't think of the word for a second, just my model for how am I going to present this to say, I'd like us to acquire the Casper Suite. I was starting to list all the features, and I'm like, this would be great. And I had this huge list that I could present to my supervisor and say, look at the things that we can do. And then as I sat down later on, and I was like, oh my goodness, that means we have to implement all of this stuff. All of this stuff, that's daunting. So the Casper Suite kind of almost fits in as a little bit of a parallel to this idea of service management, all the different pieces that come in. And it was important to look at that and go, as we're looking at Casper, we want to take that piece by piece at a time and fit it in with the services that we have offered. So with that, we're going to talk about this idea of continual service improvement. Continual service improvement, for me, is at the core of what service management is about. So you have a service, and if you offer something, how can we improve it, right? You also have the other question of maybe should we be offering this service? We have this when it comes to loaner laptops. There are times when it'd be so nice to just not deal with loaning laptops out to anyone, but as it stands, it's a service we offer, so our question is primarily how can we improve it? The other question might be is if you aren't offering a service, should you be, right? And the place where that comes in is that as you're considering about adopting a service, make sure you do it well, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But in looking at continual service improvement, and particularly how it pertained to Casper, I wanted to just give a few different areas and some of the considerations that we had when it came to it, and the ways that we saw Casper as being a tool that was really going to bring benefit to either certain services or certain ways of offering services to the campus. And the first place that Casper really just seemed to be evidently helpful was in the realm of bottlenecks. I know this never happens with anyone else, but I'm probably the only person here who's ever responsible for something that no one else knows anything about, right? So often in our jobs, and this gets into that hero complex, right? You swoop in, you do something to save the day, and sometimes it's something that only you're able to do, right? And if that doesn't get documented, if that doesn't get written up, how do you actually extend that if you're ever not there? So, for example, right now, while I'm at this conference, there's one other person who helps me in terms of deploying software to machines. But as it stands, if a faculty member needs a piece of software, let's say SPSS, and they don't already have it on their computer, they have to make a request. That request gets passed to myself and this one other person. If neither of us are there, that request literally is stuck until one of us gets back. And those are the bottlenecks that we would really like to avoid, if at all possible. And Casper seemed it's giving us an opportunity to really improve on that, because we're able to go from a place where right now there's just a couple of people that can actually step in and do this, to having a system where a number of admins, in our case, our client services team, which is responsible for that. In some places you might call it tiers. We don't really do the tiered support model, but kind of that first tier or first line of defense. They're the ones who are closest interacting with our faculty and staff most regularly. And to be able to give them the power to say, you know what your users need, and if someone either calls in and needs something, or if you know that your department would like a piece of software, you have the power to add it to them. We've taken the time to package it, and it still means there's still some places for bottlenecks. For example, packaging right now would be kind of like that. But to be able to start expanding those things out so that there's fewer things where it's just dependent on you, or maybe you and your small team. I know it can be a bit scary. It's nice having the job security when there's stuff that only you can do. But being able to free those pieces up, it goes a long way toward improvement. And we'll talk about one of the areas where that is impactful in a second. But the next thing I want to look at is the idea of software as a service. This is another thing that Casper is going to be particularly useful for. And it ties in with the idea of bottlenecks, because I am super excited about the self-service portal. I think there's going to be a few more talks like right after this one about self-service, and it sounds great to me. I mean, the ability to give to as long as I've got the software together, I no longer have to handle okay, this computer needs that. If they want the software and they know to go to self-service, they can get it and install it as long as we're licensed in such a way that it could go to everyone in the campus. To me, that's great, because it means I get away from having to guess which is what are the right pieces, and they get what they would like. One key point, though, when you're thinking about this is back to the top, continual service improvement. Self-service is a great place for service improvement if the person wants control. If they don't want control, we have a handful of people that would much rather be literally walked through the process, or they don't want to touch it at all, they want you to do it for them. If they want you to do it for them, offering them self-service doesn't really add any value. So tying it back in with service management, you want it to add value. So one of the things that we've had to think about in terms of really tying this piece of Casper into service management is make sure we present self-service not even necessarily as the first choice, but as a choice, right? Options are great for people. People like having options. It gives them an ability to choose. But as soon as you tell them this is either the way you should do it, or even worse, like you have to do it this way, it really can turn people off. And unfortunately, we're in positions where perception matters. If you have the perception of being responsive and being helpful, that goes a long way towards how your interactions are with people. Whereas if you're viewed as being either cold or distant or kind of pushing tasks off or not wanting to deal with people, that has some real impact on either how they interact with you or how your organization is viewed as a whole. And it's one of the things that, that being able to kind of improve that by introducing new pieces, new features within tool sets as options and not just forcing it is a real place where you can improve both the individual service that's offered as well as improve how the organization as a whole is viewed. So another piece that we'll look at is automation. And there's a lot of things that Casper can do for automation. I mean, you could talk about being able to re-image labs nightly and things like that. I wanted to highlight just one very specific case for our faculty and staff computers that's coming up. We hadn't been encrypting our Mac laptops, but with File Vault 2 and 10, it was kind of like, well, we need to start doing this. Like this has been a priority. Windows machines were all getting BitLocker as soon as they were moved on to Windows 7. But the Macs were kind of just ignored. Again, this fits back into, right, you don't forget about them, right? But they've been kind of just ignored. It was a little too much trouble to get it working right. What were the implications and all that? And so among these steps now, when a faculty or staff machine member has a machine set up for them by our client services department, among the steps they have to do is encrypt the computer. Now, part of it, you'd say, well, that's easy. You go into encryption, you turn it on, set the password, and you get a key, or you have an institutional key. You can talk about the merits of which one of those you want. We then have to save the recovery key somewhere so that we can help recover if for some reason they forget the password or things like that. But the part of that is you're starting to add more and more steps to a setup process that really don't need to be done, or that if you forget to do something, you have a real potential for problems. What if the key doesn't get saved correctly, and then they can't get into their machine? Things like that are a concern. And so right now, instead of having a folder where all of these keys are saved in as individual text files tied into a computer, it's going to be great to be able to move into a step where all they have to do is click an encrypt button, maybe within self-service or by some other means. You have the ability to automate with smart groups so that if it's a faculty or staff machine and it's a laptop and it's not encrypted, encrypt it. And then the further benefit of that is that you can the key is saved within the JSS. So you're no longer trying to manage these files of what's associated with which computer. You got that there. So it's a very specific kind of small case, but it goes a long way towards making improvements in this realm of automation that adds some real value. And in this case, the value is not one that is directly for the customer. That's one that really helps the support staff. That they can be freed up from a few steps in a task that gets very kind of tedious and time-consuming and has that potential for error. One more thing to talk about, and it's a little bit loose, I wanted to throw it in there. How many of you like doing inventory? Does anyone actually like doing inventory? We have like one or two people. I don't like inventory. I think most people kind of hate inventory. It's one of those things that it doesn't feel super important except for maybe like a business office that then needs to track track equipment and things like that. And normally, what makes it worse is that as soon as you start to neglect inventory, you really don't want to do it because it's even more work to actually get everything up to date. And that's just pain. That's just pain. So one of the things that kind of the questions that we had come up when it came was, well, what can Casper do for inventory? Well, there's a few things. One, you have all the information about all your computers within there. And so there's a lot of potential for Casper to be like the go-to inventory for our Macs. Well, that's great, except that we don't only have Macs. And how useful is it to have something where it's really that separated out? So we have, in the course of implementing service management, a configuration management database. Now, that piece lets us put in all of our equipment with a wide array of fields as far as purchase price, date, when it's going to be refreshed, all sorts of things like that. So in thinking about Casper and inventory and how that fits into continual service improvement, the pieces come in the realm of, well, how can we grab data from it using the APIs and things like that? What can we pull out of Casper to feed into this system so that more of our Mac stuff is up to date automatically, or at least we can automatically grab things via reports and then import them as needed into our system. A piece here as well, again, thinking back to value. When you're working with inventory, it's only valuable if it's good, right? Like an out-of-date inventory system is not really that valuable. And so make sure, just a little kind of point here, make sure that the inventory piece is not going to take away. I mean, it's easy with again, all that Casper can do. If you start just saying, well, Casper will take care of handling our Macs, and you let that cause where they might have been managed in other places to suffer, that can really harm things. So keep that in mind. The next place we're going into is being able to measure our service improvement and just kind of measuring of services in general. It's great to be able to offer services. With there being so much in Casper that we want to be able to use as tools to help offer the services that we have, it's exciting to work with. But one of the challenges is if you can't measure the software that you have, or the services, how are you going to know if you're improving? And this is one of the things that I think often gets neglected, is you figure out ways of implementing something and you don't really have a way of knowing, are you doing it well or not? And Casper provides some means for that. For example, being able to tell when software is installed and having, again, as mentioned, smart groups, for example, that can do things based on whether or not a computer has received a certain policy or is configured in some way. But this is really, I think, one of the other pieces at the core of service management, which is when you're developing a service, work out ways to measure it. And I'm going to give a brief example on something that is not directly IT related, but I think it kind of explains it well, which is this. Our client services team, which I'm a part of, has been doing what we would call a day board. So for a while, it was just kind of everyone was working on their task, and they would put things on their calendar as needed, but it wasn't all there. And it was kind of a vague sense of, yes, we're all busy, and we know we're all busy, but what do we do with that? So my supervisor decided that, well, we want to start figuring out where are we getting stuck and how can we improve on this. So we've been taking basically daily a sticky, writing down the task we want to do, putting it up on a board that's kind of just a chart for each day of the week and our names. And we meet together as a group for maybe 5 or 10 minutes, chat through what we're going to do, and you go back to your day. It's not a commitment of I have to get to these things, because then the reality of it is there's stuff that's unplanned that happens. You account for that in this. And then over the course of the days and weeks and months, you can start to chart and see what are the things that are taking up time, right? What are the requests that we're getting in regularly, right? How often do password resets come up? And as you start to track these things, you can then actually improve and go, okay, well, we need to dedicate more time on the phones because we're getting these types of requests coming in. And so it's really critical to be able to measure your services. You don't want to invest a lot of time in getting a service up and running and then not know if you're doing a good job with it because you can't measure it. And that ties further back in with value, because if you can measure it, you can usually make a better case for how it's valuable if maybe there's a little bit of pushback or just some lack of understanding. So I think with that, we'll just briefly into a few takeaways, recapping the points, and then I'll hand it back over to Katie. But the first one is, again, think about Apple support. There have been a few other talks on this, so I won't say a lot more, but don't let it just be one of those things that's neglected, that falls back to the background. And develop good services. This is one where, I mean, you may disagree on this a little bit, but it's much better, especially when you're starting fresh, right? And if you have the time to do it, to develop a good service versus offering a lot of services. And the reason I say this is, if you have a good service, people like it and it's favorable, right? That's kind of easy and straightforward. If you don't offer a service, if you don't offer a service at all, that's not great, right? Like there's a problem there. But if you opt instead to offer a bad service instead of no service at all, that really can impact the good services that you do have, because the view becomes that the services you offer are poor. In my interactions with faculty, they're much more pleased to know that what we offer works well versus what we just don't offer at all, than to say, well, I'm glad you do this, but you don't really do it that great. And so to be able to actually take the time to develop good services, and one of the pieces here is to actually carve the time out of your schedule. This fits in the category of things that are important but not generally urgent. And so often that gets neglected for the things that are both urgent and important, and the things that are urgent but not important, because the urgency often wins out in our field. And it's really, I think, to the detriment of developing these good services. So take the time, if you have the luxury of building it into a calendar where that can be respected, do it. If you really do need to be able to respond to all of the urgent stuff, try to work out some other way, whether it's with a supervisor or a team where you can share the load and say, I will be on call for the urgent things and during this time, and then you can work on the important things that aren't urgent, and then switch. Another thing is, again, measuring them, being able to measure it, and then really from there, how do you improve on it? So with that, I think I'm going to hand it back over to Katie. She's going to talk a little bit more about some of the other new things.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so this is the part where I have to improvise just a tiny bit, because not everything that we can actually think about in terms of the Casper Suite and management of devices is actually absolutely available today. So iOS 7, this kind of goes back to something Stephen mentioned, where you have two different kinds of users. You have the user that says, just do it for me, and the user says, I want to have control over my device. So with iOS 7 and service deployment, we have to measure and actually figure out a nice middle ground between those two, and give users flexibility and figure out what it is they actually want. Do you want a curated app store? Do you want us to provide VPP codes and ebooks for you? Or are you wanting to manage that yourself? Can we offload some of these functions with Casper Focus? That kind of stuff. The additional piece here in our service design is eliminating the one-off experience. We've all seen the CIO, the very important professor, whomever, show up with a new device and say, now you support this. We want to eliminate that one-off experience where we have to figure out, okay, well, we'll just cobble together something for today, and then we'll just let you run on your way. But later on, when that device comes back, it doesn't look like anything else that we've seen on our network because we had to hurry. So this goes back to designing our services with the future in mind, with expandability and extensibility in mind, making sure that we're ready for the future and that we're not alarmed by these new devices that come out, because we know Apple's going to have a new announcement in a week or two. We know there's going to be new hardware coming our direction. We know that Apple's going to release hardware that's going to be dependent upon a new iOS or a new OS X. We have to be ready for that. And rather than panic, do it badly once, and then get our stuff together later, we should probably be ready up ahead. So, and in the future, we'll have additional MDM services to offer for iOS 7, whether that's VPP code management, over-the-air supervision, that kind of stuff. These are the things listed as coming soon on the website. So these are additional services that we can build in. We know they're coming. We should be ready for it and have a plan. So for Mavericks, I have to talk even more vaguely about this, right? The one thing that it struck me, I was looking at Apple's published public stuff to say, what did they talk about during WWDC? And the thing that struck me was that they were talking about content. They were talking about iBooks. They were talking about notifications, maps. These are the things that people are going to want help managing. It's not unlikely that a student is going to walk up to a lab machine with their iPad and say, look, I've got all my textbooks on my iPad. I want to be able to read them on the lab machine when I log in. Okay. So we need to have a plan to prepare for their content as a service that we are managing. Finally, we kind of have to think about kind of a larger environment. Stephen is lucky in that he is a Casper admin with maybe a bunch of tier 1, tier 2 folks that are talking to him saying, hey, by the way, can you fix this? And then the constituents underneath there might be talking directly to tier 1, tier 2. They might be talking directly to Stevens. This is a relatively flat organization that he's working in. Sites, not so helpful for him. But as we scale upward, the scale of our services actually remains the same. So in a different higher ed environment where you might have a very distributed environment, you might have a central IT office that's trying to do management for all the colleges that are distributed, maybe even widely geographically. There's actually a university that I was just talking to an account manager earlier today. They're trying to do this. They're looking at sites. They want sites to take care of this for us. And so our model changes a little bit. Instead of just Steven, now we've got other admins. And they're also tier 1, tier 2 for their people. They've got constituents talking to them. And Steven, or the Steven equivalent in our model here, also still has constituents talking to him. So our customer load is more distributed. We're now an admin of admins. This is a different model, a different idea. We can be kind of the root Casper admin for all, but we also have to answer to these site admins. Do our services scale for this? If we design our imaging, if we design our management, our application distribution, our self-service, can we accommodate the new customer level of the admin who's asking us for assistance? And again, we weigh this issue of user independence versus just do it for me. You might have a site admin who says, yeah, whatever, just set up a policy, make it go for me. Or maybe they want full independence. They want to run the show for their subset of inventory. We have to be able to design our services to accommodate that. But the good news is that if we're smart, our services scale upward, and as more people use our services, we become that much more valuable and that much more integral to the environment of our distributed IT support. And I think that's my pet dream. Once upon a time, I worked in higher ed, and that was what I wanted. I wanted everybody to say, yay, Casper admins. That was what the goal of the service deployment was, to make everybody value, even if they didn't know that this was a service in the background. Because we weren't doing the superhero reactive thing, showing up and just saving the day. We were just designing solid services in the back end that they could use nice and transparently according to their own needs. So that's kind of how we project upward with our service management. And I think we have maybe a few questions that I've kind of pre-composed, because I'm curious to ask Steven some general ideas, about how he's thinking about stuff moving forward. So I'm going to actually steal my notes here. Okay. So Casper's new to your environment.
Yeah.
And that means you're moving from a former sort of management system into this new, and you're also learning IT on the fly, ITSM on the fly as you go. So I'm wondering, how do you make the time for that? You were saying you build it into your schedule. How does that work?
Yeah, so I'm fortunate, as I mentioned, I have a great boss, and that obviously goes a long way to it. She was very insistent that we implement something called Q2 time within our organization. And the idea being that if you have this quadrant of not important to very important and not urgent to very urgent, right? Where do things fall within that? And if you kind of just divide it up into four pieces, you have the important and urgent, the important and not urgent, the urgent and not important, and the not important, not urgent. I think I got that right. The important urgent stuff always wins. The not important, not urgent stuff generally never gets done. And unfortunately, then the next thing that usually gets addressed is the urgent but not important stuff, because someone who's on the phone with you or has just sent you an email saying, "Oh my goodness, I need this for my class right now. It's happening." Those are the calls that often win out, and so our supervisor basically crafted and said, "I want you to schedule what's called Q2 time." So this important but not urgent into your schedule, and when you schedule that time, you can go somewhere else. You can, close the door, hide behind, go wherever you need to do to be able to work on that uninterrupted. You can feel free to say, if someone comes up to you, "I'm in my Q2 time right now. I will respond to that as promptly as I can as soon as I'm finished." And obviously there's some discretion in there, because sometimes the important urgent things do pop up during that, and you want to be able to respond to them. But that's really been how I've made it work, is that, so just to give you a quick idea, we purchased Casper at the end of May, had our jump start in mid-July, and now in education, starting something in mid-July when classes start at the end of August, not a great time to be trying to figure out how to do a lot of this. So we had to kind of put a lot of that on hold while we continued to do everything as we had done years before to get pieces up and running. But over the last month or two, I've just started scheduling out a few hours once a week, just basically taking an afternoon off to go work exclusively on Casper. And it gave me the chance to actually sit down and start to learn these things and ask these questions of how do I implement this piece? What do I do? What am I looking for?
So what are your documentation challenges while you're doing this?
Yeah, documentation challenges are tough. I think I developed a little personal wiki for myself to just kind of keep track of the changes and things that I'd made as I've gone. And that's been useful, but it's really only useful for me, which doesn't go a lot more than having stuff all up in your head. One of the pieces that we have is we have a knowledge base that's in place. And I haven't done a lot with it now because most of our implementation has more been me poking at things and seeing how does this work. But the idea is to take it from there and say, okay, once I know, what it takes to then add a piece of software and get it deployed properly. When do I point to Casper's documentation for how to do that? And if at all possible, you want to just simply link to the things that already have answered these questions. But if it is new, or if it's unique, or if it's how did we need to set up something specifically for our environment, the idea is it's going to go into our knowledge base. And our knowledge base is split up such that we have a general purpose knowledge base that anyone with an account can log into and search and view. And we have what's called a support analyst portal, which has articles that may contain either sensitive or information that wouldn't be appropriate for all of campus, but that is appropriate for our IT staff. So the idea is to be building those articles up as we go.
So with that in mind, you've got kind of different audiences. You've got your internal support and you've got the external customers who are talking to you. How have they reacted so far as you're building your Casper service? What have you been able to roll out so far to different people? And how's that working?
Yeah, we haven't rolled out a whole lot yet. Most of it has been testing, and it's gone under some of the challenges of things. We had some hiccups as we upgraded to 9, and fortunately, I hadn't had much of a system developed, so upgrading to 9 was a little easier to do that carefree without having had a system established. But that stuff has been worked out. The pieces that we're doing has been kind of showing off self-service, and I think that has gone a long way for our support staff to be able to have that portal that will be there. Now, it doesn't have really much of anything in it right now, just a few things that I've played with, and most of those I've hidden back while I'm working on kind of doing things correctly. Again, taking the time to do it well and not just do it fast. The ability, one of the things that was helped out in our Jumpstart was the idea of a first aid button that basically will take care of some of the minor troubleshooting tasks. Being able to have some of those things offered firsthand so that you can see, as well as showing kind of what is the type of information that Casper collects, so and how can our client services team use that. So if they're working with a computer that's having problems, someone reports it, they're trying to figure out why did some software not get installed. It's shown that it's going to be really useful to say, well, okay, first they look in the JSS and see, well, what does that say? But then right there, they have access to the MAC address easily. It's not something they have to go figure around or dig up to then check with our network team and say, well, why might this computer not be connecting properly?
So comparing your experiences, previous management to Casper, have you run into any unexpected wrinkles? Has this posed any unexpected challenges? And knowing that you have this service catalog in the background that you have to eventually populate with stuff about Casper.
Yeah, I think the wrinkles are really not getting over your head, like not trying to take the whole elephant and eat it at once. Because with everything, when I came in, right, the existing stuff was in place, and it was mostly just, it was really get running as fast as you can, learn how to do everything that we're doing right now. And this is the first chance I've really had to actually develop a system and not just be forced to kind of, how do I make things work as they've always worked, given that I don't know where everything is coming from. So I think that one of the challenges in that is being diligent with that Q2 time. It's so easy to say, oh, I really need to work on something else. I really need to get this other thing done because it's important. And so much of that plays into that hero mindset again, right? It's okay to let go of the hero mindset, not be the hero immediately that day because you're going to establish something that is much better and much more effective in the long term. I think, and one of the other pieces mentioned was like, so that upgrade to Casper, that was a wrinkle. It wasn't intended, like something was not exactly right, and still working through that. But to also make sure that as we're testing this, in this case, the upgrade is now through and complete and it's looking good. Before I invest a lot more time in it, make sure that these next minor upgrades go smoothly so that I can kind of say going forward with confidence, right, when another upgrade comes out, how do we actually apply that?
That's it for my questions.
Yeah.
Anybody else have questions out there?
Yeah.
You talked about managing services, but there's another part to that coin, managing expectations.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like to know how you guys specifically in your university do that. Is that done through a CIO? Is that done through a dean? Is it done through a higher authority? Do you guys have to do it from the ground up? What are your abilities there to manage your users' expectations?
Yeah, so just for the sake of the recording, the question was about managing expectations of the users, kind of where and how that's done within our organization. It's a little bit of a mix. We have, for a long time, Pomona was fairly open range as far as things go. Some things were very controlled. So in the past, for example, the admin Windows environment was extremely controlled, and that expectation was just set, right? This is what you're going to get. This is how it's going to be. And then I think because of the way the Macs were kind of brought in, they were left with an expectation that had been set just by how they were adopted. So you first have that expectation of you're kind of, not on your own isn't quite right, because again, there were some support pieces that were fit in. But there wasn't, I think, a strong commitment or push to say from the top down, we're going to be committed to supporting that. So I think the Mac user generally had this expectation of, I have a machine that I chose, and I get to work with the kind of the pros and cons with that. As it's become much more, I guess you could say, mainstream, right? As it's just become one of the choices that you have instead of you really had to kind of go out of your way to get a Mac. The expectations get set really in a few places. We have a dean of the college and a dean of the faculty and things like that. That they're usually the person that at the very end of the day, when they say jump, you have to jump. They're the one that is going to have a lot of say over things, and you want to respond well. And part of that is because of not just because of an executive position or something like that, but because because of where they're coming from. They're taking the feedback they've received from their core faculty team, which is generally feedback that is from the faculty as a whole. That piece probably drives the most of it. And to give you one example, we just with some turnover in terms of kind of who and what some of our VPs and deans were, we had some new people come in, and there'd been a period where IT's presence was bad, like it kind of recently, where it was a hassle to work with, or it was slow, or just all sorts of things that kind of felt a little weird, because you're looking at it and every single person in the organization is working hard. We're trying to do it well. And I'm sure you guys can probably relate to that. You're working hard, you're trying to get stuff done right, done well, and you're making compromises where you have to, but you're not coming to work to be less than excellent, right? We want to do well at our jobs. And so when this news came in, right, from that high up level saying, hey, something's not right, one of the things that our boss did, so then she worked to help both set our expectations and to set customer expectations, committed to this idea of what's called one thing. And the idea being, well, some stuff isn't going right for you, we understand that. So picking certain people and say, if we could offer, if IT could do one thing for you, what would it be? And that's gone a long way, because we've only been doing this for maybe a month or so of kind of things and thoughts, and it certainly helps coming from, it's a wealthy private college, so they have money to throw at certain things when they need to. That obviously goes a long way, and not every organization is as fortunate to have something like that. But it's one of those things where finding out what is one specific thing that IT can try to do to help you, right? And to start setting those expectations, because you realize there is going to be the long haul of work, right? For example, when we get to the point where Casper is really up and running and fully offering and complementing a lot of the services that we have, it's going to, that'll be great. But in the meantime, what can we do? And our boss then gave us the ability as individual staff members to further help set those expectations and say, you can choose when you're talking with someone, should this become a one thing? So I don't want to talk a lot on this. One specific piece of that, I was working with a staff member. They received a new computer for their classroom. The old computer normally just gets cycled back into our refresh trickle-down policies. And they asked, well, is there any way this could become like a computer for students to use in a little library that I have next to my office? And that was the perfect example of, hey, one thing we can do to help improve this person's interactions with IT. So, yeah, Other? Just start in the front.
Yeah, so you kind of talked about how you use the Casper infrastructure to turn out a service you might not necessarily want to offer, like a loaner laptop,
Yeah.
from a bad service to a good service. Is that an example of one you did? Like, did you fix loaner laptops?
Not yet. So yeah, Casper is very primitive at this point in our organization. We haven't deployed it to most places because, as mentioned, the focus was, okay, we received it. Now we have to put it on hold while we get everything up and running for the fall. So that's one of the pieces. And the best, where I'll put it in terms of is it's on the radar of things to do. We haven't done it yet. But I want to get to the point where our faculty and staff, for example, once a machine has been categorized in the JSS as a loaner, it'd be great to be able to give them, so that all they have to do is basically like image it, and it gets everything a loaner should get. And that's something that could be really, really automated because they don't need to think about how is this configured, right? We know exactly how it's configured because it gets a guest account. It's not for a specific person necessarily, things like that.
You talked about having to bite off a bite-sized chunk. For defining your services, what were your low-hanging fruits, the ones that you're having to do first? What's your prioritization for your chunks?
Yeah. First, so the question was, how do we prioritize the services? What is the low-hanging fruit we go for? Things like that. The first piece of it was that when we went from a state of no service catalog to having a service catalog, I kind of missed that whole piece. I just graduated, was away for a little less than a year, and then came back after they'd finished. I kind of lucked out there, I guess you could say. But the idea was, first off, they just listed everything. They kind of hashed out what were all the different services that we think we're offering. And from there, then the management team kind of stepped in and said, what do we really want to be doing, kind of fleshing some of those out. For me, the way I view it, and this is an unfortunate casualty of things, I kind of focus on the lab and classroom environment and use that as my test ground. So I kind of identify pieces, what pieces are appealing and work well for others. I work those out in the lab classroom environment where it's very controlled, and then I work to extend that well in the faculty staff environment. So I think really one of the biggest low-hanging fruit pieces is that software as a service, being able to grab that on demand, or at least have our staff be able to help install that well right off the bat. I think that's probably the biggest piece that we're aiming to really get done well quickly, because it's something that can fit in place with our existing management system, in that we can just add self-service in and they can start getting new things. We don't have to completely enroll and get Casper set up and running to get self-service going. We can just get that piece in. So again, take that bite first. Yeah. There's, I think, another question there.
You guys mentioned that you can add value by serving both the user who wants you to just come in and do things for them, and the user who is going to show something. Starting in IT, I fell into the philosophy of always teach, and that way they can help themselves and do less of a, consume less resources. So how do you
Balance that? Yeah. So the question was, how do you balance the user that wants their hand held for everything versus the person that wants to do everything themselves? And I think the key there is take the this has been mentioned, I think, at a few of the different talks. Take the time to talk to your customers, interact with them, and get to know them. And where that either may not be possible or you may be spread just too thin to do that. In our case, this is where the client services team helps out. Now, having been a student at the college, now working there, I have a pretty good interaction base of people that I know throughout the campus. But for people that may not be have that luxury, the other coworkers on my team, they have worked with these departments for years. So they're the one who is going to be in the position to say, this user, I can hand it to them and say, use self-service, and they will be all for it. And that's a great teaching piece. They're also the one who's going to know, how do I very slowly introduce this other person to self-service, where maybe the first time they call in needing something, you connect to their computer, you open up self-service, you install it, and you close it while they're there watching. just like that's how they get used to you fixing things or adding software in the future. And then over the course of time, you might be able to start saying, this is something that if you ever feel, maybe if this happens on a weekend when we're not around and we can't offer support, you can feel free to give this a try if you'd like. And if you have any questions, call, and kind of just phrasing it in that very friendly customer service attitude, and remembering that it's not just about getting them software, but doing so in a manner that they're receptive to. Anything else? Yeah. Well, thank you very much for coming. Enjoy.